Jennifer stood in her son's empty bedroom, the silence so heavy it made her ears ring. On the pillow, where 10-year-old Leo should have been sleeping, lay a single cream-colored envelope embossed with a gold seal she didn't recognize. Outside, the red taillights of an unidentified black sedan flickered through the trees before vanishing into the Naperville mist. When she grabbed her phone to call her husband, she found her access denied. Every shared account password had been changed, and a new message from an unknown number glowed on the screen. "He's in better hands now. Don't make this difficult." The scent of her mother-in-law's suffocating lilies still hung in the hallway, clashing with the metallic tang of the cold rain lashing against the siding. Jennifer sprinted to the garage, but the heavy door refused to budge, the power cut from the outside. In the reflection of the darkened window, she saw a shadow move near the tree line. Someone was watching the house, waiting for her to break. She realized with a jolt of ice in her veins that the legal documents she had signed months ago weren't for a college fund, and the person she shared her bed with had just become her son's kidnapper. Jennifer Hamilton sat on a low plastic chair designed for children, her knees nearly touching her chin. Across from her, a teenager's shoulders shook with rhythmic, silent sobs. The boy's face remained buried in the depths of an oversized, faded hoodie that smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old sneakers. In the small school counseling office in Naperville, the air carried the scent of dry chalk dust and the lingering sweetness of the apple tea Jennifer had prepared moments ago. She remained still, resisting the professional urge to fill the silence with platitudes. Instead, she watched the way the fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting a clinical hum over the boy's grief. She waited until the gasps slowed, her own hands folded neatly in her lap, a silent anchor in the small room. The boy finally looked up, his eyes rimmed with a raw redness that mirrored the exhaustion Jennifer carried in her own marrow. He reached for a tissue, the box resting on a low table between them, and Jennifer noticed the way his fingers trembled. She didn't offer a rehearsed speech about resilience or the bright side of a broken home. She simply leaned forward, her posture an invitation rather than a demand. "It's a lot to carry," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet steady enough to hold the weight of his stare. In that moment, the sterile walls of the school seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them in a pocket of hard-won honesty. The drive home through the winding streets of Naperville felt longer than usual. Jennifer pulled her old sedan into the driveway of the ranch-style house she shared with Mark and Leo. The yellowed vinyl siding and the slightly sagging porch chair greeted her like old, tired friends. Inside, the hallway was a familiar obstacle course of Leo's discarded sneakers and Mark's heavy briefcase. Jennifer dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl on the console table, the metallic clatter echoing through the quiet house. She walked toward the kitchen, her mind still tethered to the sobbing boy at school. But her focus shifted as she spotted a thick, cream-colored envelope resting on the kitchen counter. The paper was heavy, the kind that spoke of old money and unyielding tradition. Jennifer's fingers traced the embossed crest of the St. Jude Academy, a prestigious boarding school on the outskirts of Chicago. She felt a cold prickle of dread beneath her skin. As she pulled the letter out, the words seemed to leap off the page. A formal notice of enrollment for Leonard James Hamilton. Her breath hitched. She hadn't applied. Mark hadn't mentioned it. There was only one person with the arrogance to orchestrate a child's life without consulting his mother. Evelyn. Jennifer stood frozen in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. The letter detailed the curriculum, the boarding requirements, and the generous endowment that had secured Leo's place. It was a kidnapping disguised as a scholarship. She looked at the magnetic drawings on the fridge, Leo's lopsided rockets and cosmic landscapes, and felt a sudden, sharp surge of protective fury. This wasn't just about a school. It was an invasion of the sanctuary she had spent years building. When the front door groaned open, Jennifer didn't move. Mark entered, his shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. He didn't look at her, instead heading straight for the cabinet to pull out a bottle of scotch. Jennifer held the letter up, the paper rustling in her shaking hand. "Mark, what is this?" Her voice was low, vibrating with a tension she couldn't hide. Mark paused, the glass clinking against the counter. He finally met her eyes, and Jennifer saw the familiar flicker of fear. The same fear he had carried since he was the boy in the military academy, broken by his mother's will. "It's an opportunity, Jen," Mark muttered, his voice lacking any conviction. He poured a finger of amber liquid and swallowed it in one go. He explained, his words tumbling out in a rush of excuses, that Evelyn had found a way. She had used an old power of attorney Mark had signed years ago during a period of financial instability. A document he had forgotten even existed. "She says it's for the best. St. Jude. It opens doors I can't." Jennifer watched him, her heart sinking. He wasn't fighting for their son. He was surrendering before the first shot was even fired. The following afternoon, the gravel under Jennifer's tires sounded like grinding teeth as she pulled onto the pristine driveway of St. Jude Academy. The campus was a fortress of dark stone and manicured lawns, a world away from the lived-in comfort of their Naperville ranch. Inside the main building, the air was thick with the smell of expensive furniture wax and the stifling weight of history. Jennifer walked down a corridor lined with oil portraits of stern men, her own footsteps swallowed by the plush runner. Director Whitmore sat behind a desk of polished mahogany, his spectacles perched on the tip of a nose that seemed perpetually turned upward. He didn't look up when Jennifer entered, his gold-tipped fountain pen scratching across a ledger with rhythmic precision. He adjusted the starched cuffs of his shirt, the movement deliberate and slow. When Jennifer began to speak, her voice tight with the effort of remaining professional, Whitmore offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It was a practiced, condescending expression that made Jennifer feel like a troublesome student rather than a concerned parent. "Mrs. Hamilton," Whitmore said, his voice as smooth and cloying as warm molasses. He gestured vaguely toward a bronze plaque on the wall, where Evelyn Vanderbilt's name was etched in bold, permanent letters. He spoke of the unprecedented grant and the legacy the school represented. Every time Jennifer tried to raise a concern about the psychological impact of a sudden boarding environment on a 10-year-old, Whitmore glided over her words, redirecting the conversation to the school's athletic facilities and Ivy League placement rates. He checked his watch, a subtle signal that her time was an indulgence he was no longer willing to grant. He stood, walking her toward the heavy oak door with a politeness that felt like a shove. The kitchen back in Naperville felt like a cage that evening. The harsh glow of the overhead fluorescent light washed the warmth out of the room, turning the tea Jennifer had brewed into a cold, forgotten liquid. Mark sat across from her, the saint, Jude envelope lying between them like a live grenade. He had a look in his eyes she hadn't seen before, a sharp, defensive edge that cut through his usual passivity. He informed her, his voice flat and rehearsed, that the full tuition, including the boarding fees, had already been transferred by Evelyn. "It's done, Jennifer," Mark said, the words hitting the table with a heavy thud. When she tried to argue, to remind him of Leo's anxiety and his love for his local friends, Mark's chair screeched against the tile as he stood abruptly. He accused her of being selfish, of letting her petty grudge against his mother stand in the way of Leo's future. Jennifer gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She watched him walk away, the sound of the bedroom door slamming shut echoing like a final verdict. She was left alone in the cold light, the smell of burnt coffee and the bitter tang of betrayal hanging in the air. The next morning, the school hallway smelled of industrial bleach and the heavy, greasy scent of the cafeteria's lunch special. Jennifer stood by Leo's locker, her hand trembling as she touched the small plastic dinosaur keychain dangling from the hook. It was a relic of a boy who was supposed to be in math class. Miss Clark, Leo's teacher, approached with a stack of folders clutched to her chest. She wouldn't meet Jennifer's eyes, her gaze darting to the floor as she adjusted her glasses. "He's not here, Jennifer," Miss Clark whispered, her voice skipping with nervous energy. She explained that Evelyn had arrived an hour earlier with a notarized permission slip signed by Mark. She had taken Leo for preliminary psychological testing at the academy. Jennifer felt a wave of nausea roll over her. The walls of the hallway, decorated with colorful, hopeful drawings of suns and trees, seemed to lean inward. She turned and ran toward the parking lot, the keys to her car biting into her palm. When she reached the asphalt, there was nothing but the long, mocking shadows of the trees stretching across the empty space where Leo should have been. Jennifer drove straight to the Vanderbilt estate, her mind a chaotic blur of fear and fury. The Gold Coast mansion sat behind iron gates, a monument to a power that felt insurmountable. Inside the living room, the atmosphere was a curated display of wealth. Leo sat in a deep, leather wingback chair, his face illuminated by the flickering glow of a brand-new tablet. On the low table beside him sat boxes of expensive Lego sets, the kind Jennifer could never justify on a counselor's salary. Evelyn stood behind him, her long, elegant fingers smoothing the hair at the nape of his neck. Evelyn didn't look up when Jennifer entered. She continued to speak to Leo in a low, melodic tone, her voice weaving a narrative of growth and masculine independence. "Your mother just finds it hard to see how much you've outgrown that little house, darling," Evelyn cooed. Leo glanced at Jennifer, and for a heartbeat, she saw a stranger. There was a cold, distant curiosity in his eyes, a look mirrored from the woman standing over him. The room smelled of hothouse lilies and the suffocating, expensive perfume Evelyn always wore, a scent that made Jennifer's head throb with a dull, rhythmic pain. Jennifer took a step toward her son, her hand outstretched to take the device. "Leo, we're going home." But the boy flinched, jerking his shoulder away from her touch with a violence that left her breathless. His face twisted into a grimace of pure, unadulterated contempt. "I don't want to go back to that dusty old place," Leo shouted, his voice cracking into a high, panicked register. He spoke of the swimming pools at St. Jude, of the important friends he would make, and how he was tired of riding his stupid old bike around their boring neighborhood. He called her a loser, the word hanging in the air like a physical blow. Evelyn straightened her back, her hands folded primly over her skirt, a tiny, victorious smile playing on her lips. Jennifer stood paralyzed, watching the gap between her and her son widen into an abyss filled with expensive plastic and poisoned promises. The house in Naperville was deathly silent when Jennifer returned alone. She sat on the sofa, the screen of her phone dark and unresponsive. She had called Mark 5 times, each attempt met with the same mechanical, indifferent greeting of his voicemail. The only sound was the low hum of the pipes in the walls and the ticking of the clock in the hall. On the dining table, 3 plates of pasta sat cold and congealed, a domestic tableau of a family that no longer existed. A text message finally arrived from Mark. "Staying at my mother's for dinner. Leo needs to settle down after that scene you made." Jennifer wrapped her arms around her chest, the chill of the empty house seeping into her bones. She realized with a hollow certainty that he wasn't coming back tonight. The walls of their home, once a sanctuary, now felt like the boundaries of a tomb, haunted by the shadows of the life they had lost. Desperation drove her back to the Gold Coast under the cover of a moonless night. The metal of the spare key she had kept for years felt like a shard of ice against her palm. She moved through the rear servants' entrance of the Vanderbilt mansion, her footsteps silent on the heavy rugs. The door to Evelyn's private study yielded with a soft, oily click. The room was a dark forest of mahogany and brass, smelling of old paper and the damp grass drifting in through a cracked window. Jennifer knelt before the small safe, hidden behind a false panel of books. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She spun the dial, her fingers moving by memory, recalling a code she had glimpsed a decade ago when she was still trying to earn Evelyn's favor. The heavy door groaned open, revealing stacks of manila folders. She began to dig, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She pulled out a folder labeled with her own name in Evelyn's sharp, elegant script. Inside was a nightmare of surveillance. There were printouts of emails from years ago, screenshots of private messages, and medical records from a fertility clinic she had visited in secret. Every page was a violation, an intimate map of her vulnerabilities and failures. The beam of her small flashlight illuminated notes written in the margins. Red ink dissecting her character, her spending habits, her every emotional outburst. Jennifer felt a slick coating of sweat break out across her neck. Evelyn hadn't just been a difficult mother-in-law. She had been a predator, documenting Jennifer's life like a specimen under glass. Deep within the pile, Jennifer found a document bearing the seal of a prominent Chicago psychoanalyst. The text was a clinical assassination of her character. It described her counseling methods as projections of deep-seated personal trauma, and labeled her empathy as a symptom of a borderline personality disorder. The doctor, a man she had met only once at a gala, concluded that she was unfit to provide a stable environment for a child. Quotes from her old journals were stitched together to make her seem erratic and dangerous. Jennifer felt a lump of pure terror rise in her throat. Evelyn had built a legal cage designed to erase Jennifer from Leo's life by turning her very heart into a weapon against her. A sharp, rhythmic clicking of heels on the parquet floor outside the study froze Jennifer's blood. She shoved the folder under her jacket, nearly knocking over a heavy silver inkwell. The steps grew louder, accompanied by the dry, silk whisper of a robe. There was no time to lock the safe. Jennifer scrambled toward the French doors leading to the terrace, the handle turning with a loud, treacherous snap of metal. She tumbled out into the night air just as the study light flickered on behind her. She crouched behind a wall of manicured boxwood, the branches clawing at her cheeks. Through the glass, she saw Evelyn's silhouette approach the desk, her hand reaching out to adjust the blotter. Jennifer didn't wait to see more. She turned and vanished into the darkness of the garden. The morning sun was a cruel, blinding glare in the office of her lawyer, Mr. Gilbert. He slid a stack of legal papers across the desk, the weight of the documents feeling like lead. He explained that Evelyn had filed for an emergency custody hearing, citing Jennifer's unstable mental state. Attached was the very dossier Jennifer had seen the night before, now transformed into an official exhibit. "Mark has already signed the temporary residency agreement," Gilbert said, his voice a drone of professional sympathy. He pointed to the signature, Mark's cramped, defeated handwriting. The boy was to stay with Evelyn for his safety until the hearing. Jennifer stared at the gold seal of the court, the room spinning. She tried to speak, but her voice was a dry rasp. The machinery of the law was moving, fueled by Vanderbilt money and her husband's cowardice, and she was standing directly in its path. An hour later, Jennifer stood in the staff restroom at her school, staring at a stranger in the mirror. Her mascara had run into dark, jagged streaks down her cheeks, making her look like a hunted animal. She splashed cold water on her face, but the trembling in her hands wouldn't stop. Outside the door, she could hear the muffled voices of her colleagues, their whispers taking on a sharp, predatory edge. A call had already come in from the school board, questioning her fitness, following a tip about her pending legal troubles. The night of the Vanderbilt Gala arrived like a looming execution. Jennifer pushed through the massive double doors of the ballroom, and a wall of noise hit her. A cacophony of orchestral music and the shrill, artificial laughter of the city's elite. The crystal chandeliers overhead cast a fractured, icy light across the polished floor. As she stepped onto the carpet, the conversations around her withered. Women in silk gowns turned their backs, their movements synchronized and cold. Men in tuxedos suddenly found deep interest in their drinks. Jennifer felt the vacuum of their collective disdain, a physical pressure against her chest. She straightened her blazer, her fingers brushing the hidden folder of stolen documents, the only heat in a room made of ice. Evelyn glided onto the velvet-draped podium, the microphone letting out a sharp, metallic chirp. Her voice, amplified and resonant, filled the hall with a terrifying, motherly warmth. She announced the creation of the New Path Foundation at St. Jude, her words lingering on the concept of protection. She spoke with a practiced, tragic tilt of her head about the need to shield a child's fragile psyche from the chaos of a broken home. The crowd murmured in sympathetic approval as Evelyn dabbed a lace handkerchief to her eye. The spotlights caught the diamonds at her throat, turning her into a shimmering icon of sacrificial love. Mark stood on the periphery of the stage, a hollowed-out version of the man Jennifer had married. His chin was set high, a mimicry of strength, but his hand gripped a champagne flute so tightly the stem looked ready to snap. He nodded in time with his mother's speech, a mechanical, rhythmic motion. He stared at a point far above the crowd, refusing to look toward the spot where Jennifer stood. Every time Evelyn made a pointed remark about stability, Mark muttered a quiet, dutiful yes. In his eyes, Jennifer saw only a gray, empty void where his soul used to be. Jennifer scanned the room until she found Leo. He was tucked away by a marble pillar, looking small and lost in a navy blazer with a St. Jude crest. His face was a mask of premature gravity, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. He held a glass of juice as if it were a shield, his knuckles white. He didn't look at the stage or the crowd. He stared at the floor, his shoulders hunched. Jennifer saw the way he flinched when a socialite tried to pat his arm. He wasn't a student embarking on a new journey. He was a prisoner waiting for the cell door to lock. She tried to move toward him, but the crowd became a solid, impenetrable wall of silk and wool. Women shifted their positions to block her path, their fans and hands raised like barriers. She heard the jagged edges of their whispers. Nervous breakdown, unstable, poor Mark. A woman she had shared coffee with just a month ago turned her head away with a look of pure, theatrical pity. Evelyn had spent years preparing this soil, and now the harvest of Jennifer's social death was complete. The very floor felt like it was tilting, threatening to slide her out into the night. Two men in black suits suddenly appeared, their presence as sudden and heavy as a falling curtain. They were security, their faces as expressionless as the stone walls of the mansion. One of them placed a gloved hand on Jennifer's shoulder, a firm, heavy weight that grounded her in the worst possible way. "Please, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, polite threat. "Don't make a scene. It's a big night for the boy." Jennifer tried to twist away, but his grip was like a vice. She looked over his shoulder and saw Leo just 20 feet away, but he might as well have been on the moon. The guards formed a human wall, their broad backs a final, insurmountable obstacle. Jennifer retreated into a side hallway, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. She nearly collided with a maid who was rushing toward the kitchen with a tray of empty glasses. The girl looked terrified, her eyes darting toward the main hall. Jennifer grabbed her arm, her voice a desperate whisper. "Where is he? Where are they taking my son?" The maid trembled, the glasses on her tray rattling. "The car is already at the back, ma'am. The trunks went out 20 minutes ago. The black limo." The girl smelled of lemon polish and fear. She pulled her arm away and vanished through a service door, leaving Jennifer in the dim light of the corridor. The realization hit like a physical blow. The gala was a distraction. Leo was being moved tonight, before any lawyer could intervene. Jennifer sprinted upstairs to the guest room where Leo had been staying. The room was sterile, smelling of lavender and old dust. The bed was made with military precision, the pillows plump and heartless. On the desk sat a single sheet of paper with the St. Jude logo. Jennifer grabbed it, her vision blurring. It was a transfer order, effective immediately, signed that morning. At the bottom was Mark's signature, the ink dark and final. He hadn't just stood by. He had authorized the exile of his own son. Jennifer crumpled the paper in her fist, the sound of the crushing parchment echoing in the empty room. The door clicked shut behind her. Evelyn stood in the frame, her silk robe shimmering like a snake's skin. She didn't bother with the mask of the grieving grandmother now. She smiled, a cold, sharp expression that made Jennifer's skin crawl. "The car will be across the state line in an hour, Jennifer," Evelyn said, her voice a soft, rhythmic purr. She explained that Leo would be in isolation for the first month to ensure a clean break. No calls, no visits. The victory was written in the very air between them. Evelyn stepped closer, her perfume a suffocating cloud of floral rot. She looked at Jennifer as if she were a discarded toy, something that had served its purpose and was now merely in the way. Jennifer turned to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Below, in the harsh glare of the security lights, the kitchen door swung open. Two men in suits led Leo toward a long, black limousine. The boy walked with his head down, his movements heavy and defeated. Mark stood by the car, a cigarette glowing in his hand. He didn't look at his son. He didn't look at the house. He stared at the ground, a man who had traded his soul for a quiet life. Jennifer watched as the car door swallowed Leo. Mark tossed his cigarette into the gravel and walked back inside, his back stooped under the weight of his mother's shadow. The limousine pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the dark throat of the driveway. Jennifer slid down the wall, the coldness of the plaster seeping through her clothes. The silence of the room was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She had played by the rules of a world she didn't understand, and she had lost everything. Her son was gone, her husband was a ghost, and her life was a series of clinical notes in a Vanderbilt file. But as the grief threatened to drown her, it hit something hard and jagged at the bottom of her soul. The politeness, the counseling, the peacemaking. It was all gone. There was only the ice-cold clarity of a woman with nothing left to lose. She stood up, her movement slow and deliberate. She reached into her clutch and pulled out the copies of the documents she had taken from the safe. She looked at the medical records, the surveillance logs, and the financial statements. She smoothed the wrinkled paper against her thigh, her hands finely, perfectly still. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to plead. She was going to walk back into that ballroom and tear the Vanderbilt world down to the studs. Jennifer moved down the marble staircase with a rhythmic, predatory grace. The chatter of the ballroom died away as she reappeared, her eyes fixed on Evelyn, who was still holding court near the stage. The guests parted like water before a prow, their faces a blur of silk and judgment. Jennifer didn't care about their stares. She didn't care about the security guards. She reached the podium and moved with a speed that caught the master of ceremonies off guard. She ripped the microphone from his hand, the feedback screeching through the hall like a dying bird. The orchestra faltered and stopped, the sudden silence more deafening than the music. Jennifer stood at the center of the stage, her chest heaving, her eyes locked on Evelyn's frozen, pale face. "Listen to me!" Jennifer's voice, projected through the massive speakers, was a thunderclap. She didn't wait for them to recover. She began to read. She called out the exact figures Evelyn had siphoned from Leo's educational trust to pay for her own private luxuries. She threw the bank statements into the air, the white pages fluttering down onto the heads of the horrified guests like a blizzard of scandal. "This is your charity!" Jennifer screamed, her voice vibrating with a decade of suppressed rage. She pointed to a line item for a Mediterranean cruise disguised as a cultural grant. The murmur in the hall turned into a roar of shock. Evelyn lunged for a falling paper, her fingers catching the edge of a sheet that sliced into her skin, leaving a thin, red line of blood across her palm. Evelyn snapped her fingers, her face a mask of purple fury. The two guards from earlier charged toward the stage, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. But before they could reach the stairs, a shadow moved. Mark stepped into their path. He stood with his feet planted wide, his shoulders squared in a way Jennifer hadn't seen since their wedding day. He put his hands on the lead guard's chest and shoved him back with a guttural, primal snarl that made the man freeze. Evelyn stared at her son, her mouth hanging open as the guards hesitated, looking for a command that didn't come. Jennifer handed Mark a stack of the surveillance logs. She watched his face as he read the transcripts of their private bedroom conversations, the intimate details of their marriage recorded by his mother's paid spies. She turned the microphone toward the crowd and began to read Evelyn's handwritten notes about breaking Mark's spirit. The room went deathly quiet. Mark's hands shook as he turned the pages, his eyes filling with a cold, terrifying light. Evelyn stood on the stage, her diamonds mocking her, her world dissolving into the sound of her own crimes. Mark looked up from the papers, and the man who had been a shadow for 10 years was gone. He looked at his mother, and the silence in the room became absolute. He let go of the champagne flute he was holding. The glass hit the marble floor and shattered with a sound like a gunshot, sending shards of crystal and gold liquid flying across the floor. He didn't blink. He took a step toward Evelyn, and the woman who had controlled every breath he took actually recoiled, her heel catching on the hem of her gown. He leaned in close to her, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to carry to the back of the hall. He didn't shout. He told her that if the limousine wasn't back at the gates in 10 minutes, every document in Jennifer's hand would be on the desk of the district attorney and the front page of the Tribune. He held up his phone, his thumb hovering over a pre-dialed number for the city's largest news desk. Jennifer saw the way Evelyn's eyelid flickered. The older woman looked at the crowd, her peers, her donors, her subjects, and saw them all holding up their phones, recording the moment her crown fell into the dirt. Evelyn's mouth moved, but no sound came out. She looked for a friend, a supporter, an ally. She saw only the cold, judgmental eyes of people who smelled a scandal. Her own inner circle turned away, their faces twisted with a mix of boredom and disgust. She was a Vanderbilt, but she was no longer one of them. She was a liability. Jennifer stood her ground, watching as the weight of the social exile she had suffered for years finally settled onto the shoulders of the woman who had created it. Evelyn's hands shook so violently, she dropped her beaded clutch. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy and pale. She had to dial the number twice, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her voice was thin and broken as she gave the order to the driver. "Bring him back, now. Turn the car around." Jennifer heard the muffled, "Yes, ma'am," through the receiver. Evelyn lowered the phone, her posture collapsing, her expensive hair suddenly looking like a brittle gray wig. She was a small, defeated old woman, standing in the ruins of a party that would be talked about for decades. The sound of gravel crunching under tires signaled the end of the war. Jennifer and Mark stood at the iron gates, their hands locked together so tightly their knuckles were white. The long black car pulled up, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The door opened, and Leo stepped out, blinking against the light. He looked at his mother, then his father, and when he saw them standing together, the wall of coldness in his expression shattered. He ran. He hit Jennifer with the force of a small storm, his arms wrapping around her waist as he buried his face in her side. Jennifer gripped him, breathing in the scent of his hair, the familiar, comforting smell of home. Mark wrapped his arms around both of them, his broad hands a final, protective shield against the world. A month later, the house in Naperville was a hollow shell of echoes and cardboard boxes. Jennifer sealed the final crate with a long, aggressive strip of packing tape. Outside, Mark was loading the last of their belongings into a moving van, his movements steady and sure. The morning sun caught the dust in the air, turning the empty living room into a golden gallery of memories they were leaving behind. Jennifer looked toward the Gold Coast, where the Vanderbilt mansion sat like a tomb on the horizon. A court order now stood between them and Evelyn, a permanent legal wall. Mark started the engine, the heavy vibration of the truck a signal of their new beginning. Leo sat in the back, his window down, his face turned toward the open road. Jennifer stepped out of the car at a gas station just past the state line. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of a different life. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the heavy brass key to the Vanderbilt mansion, the last physical link to the cage she had escaped. She felt the warmth of the metal in her palm. With a single fluid motion, she threw it into the deep, weed-choked drainage ditch beside the highway. There was a faint, satisfying splash in the murky water. Jennifer straightened her shoulders, letting the wind wash over her face, clearing away the last of the bitterness. She climbed back into the truck beside Mark and Leo, her hands resting on the wheel with a quiet, unshakable strength. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in years, it was theirs.